Hi. Let me just tell you, my name is Melissa Franklin. I am a physics professor, and with the bookstore, we run this Harvard Science Book Talks. With the bookstore, the Harvard bookstore, sorry. Harvard bookstore, the Harvard libraries, and the Division of Science. And it's really nice of you to come. I'm very, very happy. I'm particularly pleased with this book. And I'm not going to read his talk. So tonight's event is William Egginton, and he's presenting his latest book, The Rigor of Angels, Borges, Heisenberg, Kant, and the Ultimate Nature of Reality. But before I introduce him, I just want to let you know that there's some really exciting talks coming up in November. On the November 18th, it's Jim Peebles from Princeton, and he's presenting The Whole Truth, a cosmologist's reflection on the search for objective reality, which is connected. It's a theme. And on the 19th, the day after, Alan Lightman from MIT presents The Miraculous from the Material, Understanding the Wonders of Nature. So please keep tuned to the bookstore, and you'll see these coming up. Okay, so William Egginton. So first of all, this is what happened. I'm going to tell you what happened. I went to the bookstore. I usually go with a little bit of a disguise. And I go on the table where all the cool books are, and I look for science books. And then I complain later that there aren't enough. And this time, I went on the table, and there was this book, The Rigor of Angels. And I looked at it, and I thought, oh my God, I'm in love. I'm in love already. I immediately had to buy it, of course. And then, because we all have to buy books from the Harvard bookstore. And I went home, and I read it, and it fit perfectly in my head, which is not normal for my head and books like that. And I then said to the owner of the bookstore, Jeff, I said, we got to do this. And not only that, I am teaching a class called Thinking Through Writing about physics, and I'm teaching it with a novelist who's here, Claire Massoud. And I said to her, we really have to read this. And we all went completely crazy and read it all, and so did our students. And William just came to our class, and the students were, I don't know what the word is, not asleep, I think is the word. Am I doing okay so far? I'm trying to go really fast. So this book, really, really good. I know I've said that about a couple of other books. This is better. This is better. Anyhow, William Egginton, he's a guy who was born in Syracuse. That's a place where there's always a cloud, right, on top. Syracuse, New York. And his path has gone through, he went to school at Dartmouth, then he went to University of Minnesota, got a little bit of an accent, and then he did his PhD at Stanford in comparative literature. But before that, he kind of was a sciencey guy, a lot of math and physics, and so he's coming back to that now in his later elderly years. He's so young. Anyway, he is the Decker professor in the humanities at Johns Hopkins and the director of the Alexander Grass Humanities Institute. He strangely speaks German, Spanish, Italian, French, and English, which in itself is so much better than anything I have ever done. He hangs around with scientists, like daily, like Sean Carroll, who's a popularizer who's spoken here many times. They hang around and they talk about the multiverse, stuff like that. So he has a nice life, but weirdly, he's also written 10 books in the past 20 years. So I don't know where he's hanging for how long. So I started to look at the number of books, and it was just overwhelming. And then I looked at what they were about, and I wanted to buy them all. And then I thought about how much money I have in my retirement, stuff like that. I thought about many things. 5 of those books are for the public, and so you should look them up. His name is Egginton. And I think you'll like them. So when we asked, so there's 1 million of these books. I don't know. Like I looked at them, and something about Cervantes, something about the world, something about the splintering of all our minds, which obviously that hasn't happened to me. And when I asked him, like, who would you like to speak to, he said, I want to speak to Professor Homi Bhabha, who is from Harvard here, and who is our great friend, our meaning mine, and Bill, and who is the Anne F. Rothenberg Professor of English at Harvard, and who is well known for giving way better introductions than this one. So I'm going to welcome, first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to welcome Bill, and he's going to give us a little bit of a discussion of his book, and then Homi is going to be in conversation with him, and then you're going to ask questions if there's time, and ask questions like this really, really, really fast. Okay, but just if you want to ask a question, put up your hand and we'll call you. Okay.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, all of you, for coming. Thank you especially, Homi, for doing us the honor of coming, doing me the honor of coming and having a dialogue with me about this book. Because I want to save time for the dialogue, I'm going to give a very short just overview. And it's a tough book to give an overview about because it goes on, it covers in some ways a period of 2,500 years. It covers characters from the pre-Socratics up into the early 20th century. So I needed to pick something that would just kind of crystallize what I'm trying to do with this. And so this is obviously not the title of the book. I call this The Poetry of Physics. And I just have 8 slides to go through. But will give me a way of touching on each of the 3 major characters in this book. And those characters are Werner Heisenberg, Jorge Luis Borges, and Immanuel Kant. So one of the key points of this book is what I would like to call epistemic humility. It's the idea that there's a fundamental limit to how much we can know, but we have a tendency to override those limits. And those of you who have read Kant know that that's a big theme in Kant's work. That's why the work is called critical philosophy. But it's also a theme in the literature of Borges and very much a theme in the science of Heisenberg. So I want to start with that. Richard Feynman once said about the mysteries of quantum mechanics that they were all in a way distilled or carried in this one experiment. And this experiment was a thought experiment for many years. And since then, it's turned into a real experiment that's engendered very real results. And over again, these results have been confirmed. And most of you know this, and I won't spend a lot of time on it. But the basic idea is that when you allow an energy beam, and you can slow it down so that we know that one pulse or one particle is coming out at a time, you would figure that that pulse or particle has to choose a slot to go through. When it's registered on a photographic plate, we notice that it builds up a pattern that is associated with interference. It gives us the sense that these particles, if they're particles, are somehow interfering with each other, even if they have to choose, so to speak, which slot to go through, which in and of itself already doesn't make much sense. It gets a little bit stranger when we then decide to observe. And I know Melissa was going to bring a Geiger counter here and shows what an actual observation is. But you put a particle detector that will register with a click, and you'll now know which of the slots the particle goes through. And at that point, it doesn't make the interference pattern anymore. It seems to have redressed its behavior and started to act like a self-respecting particle again and stopped behaving like a wave and pretending to be able to go through multiple doors at the same time. So Heisenberg had figured out the mathematics of this, and he said the following thing in a sentence to his colleague and friend Wolfgang Pauli soon after making his discovery: a particle has no path until we observe it. It's an extraordinary thing to have said. And he went to the great dean of science at the time of physics, the leading thinker in the world, and he had this conversation. And Einstein's response to this was something along the lines of, "I'm not buying that. This makes no sense whatsoever." Something that Einstein would stick with for the rest of his days. Heisenberg made a very interesting rejoinder to that, which is, now wait a minute. What I'm doing doesn't differ fundamentally with what you were doing when, in relativity, you took space and time and showed them to be deeply interrelated with our observations. And Einstein's response, famously flippant, a good joke should not be repeated too often. And this really ended up being the kind of the core to their relationship. Deep respect, but also at the same time a failure to come together until, as I said, the end of his days. Einstein would, in fact, come up with one thought experiment after the other to push the boundaries of the thinking of what was known as the Copenhagen interpretation. And over again, those thought experiments really ended up driving science forward in extraordinary ways. But in the end, what he insisted on, which is that can't be true, that first sentence up there, what Werner Heisenberg and his crew were saying just can't be true. A particle definitely has to have a path before we observe it, has been disproved over and over again. So another character is, in my book, is the great Argentine poet Jorge Luis Borges. In the early 1940s, he published a set of stories that would be the breakthrough for him of his fiction. In fact, they're collected as fictions today. One of these stories is, for me, the story that led me to understand what was going on in Heisenberg's science. And this is, in a way, why I wrote this book. This is a story about a man who, because of an accident, he falls off a horse, loses the ability to forget. But more importantly, he loses the ability not to perceive absolutely everything with absolute perfection. Now, Borges was clearly inspired by something he'd read in the papers about a man in Moscow, and I write about that case, who had an extraordinary memory, who seemed to be incapable of forgetting anything. But as Borges was wont to do in his fictions, he took that character and he pushed this ability further and further and further. And with his extraordinary poetic ability, he provoked us to think about what would it really mean not to be able to not perceive absolutely everything. To be, if you will, a perfect observer. With one quick look, you and I perceived 3 wine glasses on a table. Funes perceived every grape that had been pressed into the wine and all the stalks and tendrils of its vineyard. He knew the forms of the clouds in the southern sky on the morning of April 30th, 1882, and he could compare them in his memory with the veins in the marbled binding of a book he had seen only once, or with the feathers of spray lifted by an oar on the Rio Negro on the eve of the Battle of Cabracho. 2 or 3 times, he had reconstructed an entire day. He had never once erred or faltered, but each reconstruction had itself taken an entire day. Think about that for a moment. Right? This is what Borges does. He puts in these details that should cause you to stop and ask, what happened to the day he was spending reconstructing the day? What happens to that presence, that lived moment? This is the point, of course, that Borges is saying. Funes, in being perfect in his knowledge, also lacks something fundamental about knowledge, something that we could call, and he does in that story, abstraction. Not only was it difficult for him to see, he says about Funes, that all the generic symbol dog took in all the dissimilar individuals of all shapes and sizes. It irritated him that the dog of 3:14 in the afternoon seen in profile should be indicated by the same noun as the dog of 3:15 seen frontally. His own face in the mirror, his own hands, surprised him every time he saw them. Again, like with the day, the entire day it takes to reconstruct the memory of an entire day, this should cause us to pause and say, but wait a minute, if he lives in an eternal present, if he's only there for this moment, and dog, our word for it, is way too general to characterize his experience of the here and now, how can he actually be irritated? Wouldn't that require him to know the difference between the dog at 3:14 and the dog at 3:15, to perceive the distance? Same thing with his face. He has to have a concept of himself, even one that spans those apparently radical differences for Funes of the here and now, and the here and now at any other time. So, Kant, the 1-minute version. This is the analytic of pure reason. It's the first part, and so the way I wanted to present this is an imaginary dialogue. Kant with a good friend of his. In fact, it's an antagonist, but he loved to think with him, David Hume. Imagine there were movies. He invites David Hume to the movies. David Hume, the great empiricist, would say, We can only have one image of the horse at a time. We can't know what will happen before or what happened after, right? This is not possible. You don't know for sure on the basis of this impression that hits you what's going to follow it. But Kant's answer, which was really quite brilliant, and this is the basis for the analytic in the Critique of Pure Reason, is if that were true, you wouldn't even be perceiving the horse. Because if all you are is completely immersed in a impression, an essential impression, with no sense of what he calls synthesizing moments over space and time, you're not perceiving anything. In fact, that difference, that minimal difference from total immersion is what's required for you to be perceiving in the first place. So it's impossible, in fact, to observe an isolated slice of space-time. If we slow time down to a single frame, if we hone the moment of an observation to a pure present, we destroy that observation. The closer we look, the more the present vanishes from our grasp. And yet in some ways, that's exactly what Heisenberg was trying to figure out. Because what are we trying to do when we focus in on the movement of a particle? So Heisenberg, I say, writes a poem. You didn't know that about Heisenberg. This is what his poem looks like. And it looks scary. Like most of you are interested in science. It's probably not scary at all to you. It was to me the first time I looked at it. And then I dwelt with it, as one should with a poem. I let it sink into me. I realized that in basic mathematics, if you were to take the delta of something like position and reduce it to zero so that now you know exactly where something is, in an equation where one of the variables is zero, the other side of the equation should turn to zero right now. But it doesn't. There's a very small number that it has to stay larger than, and that's the number that Heisenberg put to it. This is the famous h bar based on Planck's constant. What that means is if you reduce one of your variables, you reduce your uncertainty of one of your variables to zero, the other one explodes to the infinite. It could be absolutely any momentum you could possibly imagine, and vice versa. That, to me, is poetry. It's poetry like a haiku. It's condensed to its absolute most limpid, clear presentation. The problem of trying to focus in on a single, isolated slice of space-time and the impossibility of doing so and still being an observer. Thank you. Homie, come and join me.
Well, your audience is going to feel completely cheated because, as you know, and you asked for this.
I asked for this, yes.
My interest is very much, as somebody whose knowledge of physics and quantum mechanics does not even exist. What I'm very interested in is the design of the project, because I think the design of the project really is the innovation that you have introduced here. And it seems to me that this is a translational work. And the translational moment here is the way in which Walter Benjamin describes translation in the last figure of his translation essay, where two things come together, they touch and they go in their different directions. And here, I think that the book is that touch. You've tried to bring together that moment. And in bringing together that moment, it seems to me that you have been very successful in putting together things in the Heideggerian sense side by side. So there is this notion of Heisenberg, there's the notion of antinomy, you know. Then that's Heisenberg and uncertainty, the breakdown of causality, and then the breakdown of the notion of the being in Borges, confronted with the question of desire. So just as desire has no set object, Desire's object is also always deferred, because when you satisfy one desire, you get another. And here you take antinomy and say that's embodied antinomy is absolutely part of the particle, part of the whole thinking. But then, as you also argue, causal thinking, the causal chain breaks down. When the causal chain breaks down, then the richness of your argument emerges. Because then at that point, in the broken middle, if I might call it, as Hannah Arendt calls it, you talk about morality and the ethical. So I just wanted to give a certain design of the way in which, if you think that that's the right way to put it.
I do.
And then, so the ethical issue. Now, why do I bring that up? Because what is so interesting in this book is that you talk about scientific method, in a way. You talk also about literary method, the writing of literature. And then, when you put them together, you find in that ethical space a real space to elaborate on the lives of these people and the decisions they made outside of their scientific thinking. But those subjectivities are not simply, you're not writing simply a biography of the individual.
Right.
You're trying to work out their thoughts, their ideas, their methods, and then create a relationality, as you call it, between the work and the decisions of the individuals. And what are the decisions, ethical decisions they make? Your main focus is on the question of freedom and on the question of choice and on the question of decision. So what I think is so great here is that you take the disciplinary institution or institutionalization of whether it's literary forms or whether it's scientific thinking, or etc. You take that and then you show how the individual's reaction, whether to leave Germany or to continue working for the Nazi regime in the Heisenberg case, in Borges, what does it mean to leave and then to come back, and where is the home? So in all these instances, there is something about the professional construction of persona and character. It's not only, here's the science, here's the poetry, and here's the individual. And I think that is a rather beautiful and miraculous thing that you've managed to do.
Thank you, Homi. Thank you. I want to talk a little bit about this idea of the broken middle and where ethics opens up. Because as Homi is saying, this is a book about people trying to know the world, but in the failures, in the crevices that open up between these various characters and their attempts to figure out what it means to know the world, something like Arendt's broken middle emerges. Right? There's always an incommensurability between the human and ultimately what's being known. We was pointing it out now in those opening remarks. This is something that's a moment of a kind of obsession with Borges. In the very failure that the knowing subject in Borges evinces, trying to come to a complete knowledge of the world, something else comes out, which is that desire, right? The inability to know the world equals something like, you could call it a metaphysical desire, a desire to absolutely embody everything. And those searches, all of these Borgesian characters who are searchers, who try to follow the path to some kind of an ultimate realization, never able to do so, but are driven nonetheless with a desire to do so. That opens up the question of what should one desire. That opens up the question of, faced with lack of knowledge, which we all are ultimately, what is our responsibility? And the interesting point, and I'll let you go back to your question, is that there's something that Kant is making very clear in his ethical philosophy, is that there's no formula. We think about sometimes and I talk about the Kantian ethics as well, the categorical imperative in Kant as kind of as if it were a formula. You follow these steps, you take a maxim and you see if you can universalize it, and then if you can, it's ethical. This, I think, is really a misreading of Kant. Kant's idea in his ethics is that because we don't know the right thing to do, and only because we don't know the right thing to do, only then can our behavior be ethical. A perfectly good being, a God, for example, whose omniscience and omnipotence coincide, and that being knows always the right thing to do. is not ethical for Kant.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's the issue is that in a way you start from the uncertainty principle because you know that there is this uncertainty embedded or the embodied antinomy. You start the moral progress or the moral choice or freedom is based on your not knowing. And I think this is where you also have the first philosophy of Levinas, that I am committed to you even before I know you. I'm committed to the ethical idea, just as you said. So here, I wanted to ask you two things. One, you know, you talk about relationality, and I think that's extremely important. Individual or the idea emerges from relationality. It is not there as an origin. It is not there simply as a fundament. It emerges through the breakdown of that chain of causality, but it also emerges through the relationality. And I think you use the word relationality to actually put pressure on the notion of causality, which I think is very important. So,
Can you turn your mic on?
oh, sorry, I didn't hear.
Sorry.
I'm terribly sorry. I trust nobody missed anything because I can tell you there's not much value coming from me. But so let me just say, so relationality is so important. What about the place of the unconscious? Why is Freud, I just gave the Freud lecture in Vienna, so I'm asking last week, so why is Freud and why is the unconscious, which works by creating anxiety and ambivalence rather than antinomy, not more of this book? Why is Freud not there?
So this is a great question, and as people have been asking me, why these three characters? Why not other characters? And it's true, there was a certain almost arbitrary selectivity that went into it. There was a story to be told about the relationship of humans and their knowledge and the world. And that story, as those who've had a chance to look at the book, is in some ways, in my telling, 2,500 years old. This book goes back to the pre-Socratics and up into the 20th century. I had to choose these three, and as I was just relating to, I think in Claire and Melissa's class, in fact, it turned out that I had, as I was searching for who are these three characters going to be, because I didn't want to just tell one anecdote after another over a long series of millennia, it turned out that I had dealt with this problem of knowledge in an early piece in the New York Times philosophy forum called The Stone, and it was these exact three characters. They were sort of calling out to me from the past. Pick us. We were there. But it's so true that this fundamental problem of what happens when that gap opens up between, necessary gap opens up between our ability to know the world and the world as we imagine it must be in and of itself. Well, one of the places we just talked about, one of the human subject's responses to that is desire, to situate an object and then go after it futilely over and over and over again. And that movement is a movement that situates itself vis-a-vis our values, our belief structures. And it does so in a way often that is, to use the term that you just brought up, unconscious for us. So we're driven along these pathways of desire, often in ways that are unconscious to us. We don't know why Borges desired the things that he did, why he made the decisions that he did. We speculate. I speculate in this book about what drove him, despite all of the friends and well-meaning people he had around him, who said, in the aftermath of the brutal overthrow of the Chilean government in 1973, do not accept an invitation to go to Pinochet's house and have dinner with him. What is it about Borges that when they said their reasoning behind it, you will never win the Nobel Prize for Literature, he basically said, now I have to go. So what was it about that? What about a character like a person, a great scientist like Heisenberg, who was beseeched by those around him, who said, look what's happening. Your friends and colleagues are being hounded out of Germany. Their lives are at risk. Why are you going to stay here? Why did Heisenberg stay? There's a scene that you and I were just talking about at the end when Samuel Goudsmit, a Dutch Jewish scientist who lost his parents in the Holocaust, in Auschwitz. He had tried to get, and did in fact, get Heisenberg to write on their behalf. Heisenberg did write on their behalf. The letter came too late. His parents were murdered. He then became part of the team that was really seeking to bring all of those scientists who had stayed with the Nazi regime to justice. And the two of them battled for the rest of their lives in the public sphere about that decision, about Heisenberg's decision. And then, when Heisenberg died before Goudsmit, Goudsmit was the one who wrote his obituary in the New York Times.
That's right.
And in essence, forgiving him at that point.
Yes, it was. I mean, it certainly did. I mean, it certainly exonerated him, rather like, people did with Heidegger later on, who in a different way took the same path, although more actively on the Nazi side.
I would say that as well.
Yeah, So I wanted just to add one thing and ask one thing. The thing I wanted to add was that Kant, and it illustrates what you say, but it's very actually relevant for us now, and it keeps coming back. Yes, you're quite right. It's when you have the ethical uncertainty, then that's the opportunity to be ethical. And I think with the notion of the relationality of the world that you supplement causality with, one of the ethical issues in Kant is the notion of hospitality, and particularly hospitality in the context of colonization. So he says what the British did when they went to India as traders was to abuse Indian hospitality. He doesn't simply say they imposed power. He's talking about an earlier bit. So this notion of hospitality is precisely one of those ethical notions built on a shaky foundation, but is a compulsion. I mean, that's what we need to do now in terms of refugees and migrants, and that's what Kant felt that cosmopolitanism would be based on. So I just wanted to add that to what you just said.
No, I love that, because it's also, again, a notion of cosmopolitanism is an ideal that we aspire to, always from a rootedness in a particular place, a particular time, a particular culture, with all of the blinders that they put on us. Kant obviously had his own blinders. This is one of the problems when you then go back in time and you say, well, how could someone who developed this particular ethics, an ethics that he boils down in some particularly beautiful phrases as never treat another human being as means, but always as an end in themselves, who then would say some of the things he says in other contexts about women or about people from other cultures, right? This is you sometimes have to then admit and hold a thinker from the 18th century, from the 19th century to the standards of their own philosophy and say, you came up short.
That's right. I just wrote an essay for my book called Cosmopolitanism in Extremis, because cosmopolitanism is always in extremis. The futurity, it's always a kind of ethic to come, like human rights.
That's right.
There's no end to human rights. It's always about the next struggle and the next. So I want to go back to what you just said about Heisenberg and Goudsmit.
Yeah.
And there's a beautiful line there, and you've provided the background for it. When you talk about this little fable you have of the forked path, of the decisions you make and the decisions you don't make, you echo Frost there too. And you have this line where you say, one physicist leaves, Goudsmit, and the other stays, Heisenberg. But then I want to add, but the third, in both a kind of a psychic and a poetic way, neither leaves nor stays, but takes a more surreal turn, dancing at the intersection of the forked path. That's Borges. Yeah. Borges does that, and there you then get that sense of loss, that accompanies him, the melancholia, and so on. But I want to ask you, you say we feel sorry that we cannot travel both paths and be one traveler. But I'm wondering again, with a certain kind of Freudian frisson, whether in fact we often take one path and then hanker for the other path. And that becomes our great imaginative leap, the path that we have not taken. And that also becomes the critique of where we are. So I want you to tell people about this really marvelous little parable of yours about the garden of forked paths.
Well, if only I could claim that parable as mine, but it was, of course, Borges's, and it's one of his great, great stories, again in the same collection, The Garden of Forking Paths. It's a spy story. It's a story about ultimately about the delivery of a message to the Prussian army about the location of an artillery battery in England. But the story is ultimately not about that. The story is about a man of Chinese descent who is the spy in the story, who by sheer coincidence, it seems, happens upon a sinologist. And he happens upon him because his last name, Albert, is the name of the city that he needs to convey to his Prussian superiors in order that they know the location of this target. So he heads to his house with the intention of killing him, knowing that it will show up in the papers and give the Prussians the news that they need to know, the secret message that they need to know. The story is not about that. That's the framework. The story is about what he discovers there. And he discovers that this man, Stephen Albert, is the sinologist who is in fact an expert on an ancestor of the main character, a man who had disappeared from public life in China, claiming he was a governor of a province, claiming that all he was going to do was build a labyrinth and write a novel. And nothing of the sort was ever found. He'd spent apparently his final years piling papers upon each other that didn't have any kind of coherence whatsoever. And Stephen Albert had figured out what had happened. The papers were, in fact, the labyrinth. He had written a book. But the book was not a book in the normal sense of a narrative in which a character chooses a path and stays on it. Rather, it was an infinite garden of forking paths, a book that describes time as constantly consisting of branching paths, and that every possible version of you exists in this book, every possible choice that you've made. And one of the points that I make in the book is that Borges wrote this story close to 20 years before Hugh Everett III, the great physicist and student of John Wheeler's, would come up with the interpretation of quantum mechanics that's known as the many worlds interpretation, where observations, or in fact quantum events, trigger the branching of universes, such that this is one of the ways of solving, so to speak, the Schrödinger paradox known as the Schrödinger cat. It's not that the cat is blurred out between life and death. It's that in one version of the experiment, in one reality in which the experiment takes place, the cat is alive, and in another one that branches off at that time, the cat is dead. So Borges obviously is not thinking specifically about this, but he is thinking about ethical decisions. He is thinking about a world in which I have to kill this person, his narrator, and a world in which he decides not to because of friendship. And in the end, you talked about regret. In the end, the final word of this story is this character who knows he will now hang, and it doesn't matter because he says he's completed his job, but what no one will ever know is what he feels in his heart, and what he feels in his heart is absolute contrition. He feels regret. He feels sorrow for the path that he took. And then Borges does one of those things that I was pointing out before. He pushes the impossibility of this, because if universes are branching out, if the only thing that we can say about those branching universes that I didn't take, those paths that I didn't take, is that I can't go back to them, which is what Robert Frost in fact says. If you go back to the path, you may think you're going to go back to it, but by the time you go back, it will be a different path, and you will be a different you. So you can't, in fact, the whole nature of your choice is that it is an irrevocable choice. What you feel is an affective relationship to that. You feel a desire to do the impossible, to in fact embody some person who could have taken that different path, to know truly what it would have been like to act differently in a way. And that manifests itself in Borges' story as what he calls a pullulation of bodies that fill up the garden with him and Stephen Albert, that manifest themselves. And again, in a way that's absolutely impossible, since the whole idea of making a choice, of taking a path, is that those paths aren't present to you.
That's correct. But what fiction or poetry and music do, and what it makes possible, is to think the counterfactual and to be in that counterfactual as an agent, as a subject, to occupy that. That's why I said Borges spends his whole time dancing at the cusp of the frontier.
This is a very important point because it allows, what fiction allows us to do is to inhabit that counterfactual while not inhabiting
Absolutely.
the counterfactual, right? And maintaining that difference. Because what would happen if you truly inhabited it completely? Then you would be over there, not over here, and you wouldn't in fact know that you're inhabiting it.
But that's what language allows you to do. That's the beauty of it, to be absent and present at the same time, because that is the nature of arbitrariness or difference in language as a kind of a way of mediating that thing. Final question, and then you'll have a good 20 minutes with your adoring audience. A particle has no path until we observe it. A poem has no path until we interpret it. That doesn't mean that all the trees and paths are not there, but in a way to say something, to observe it, to think about the measure of the poetic line, whether it's the verse, whether it's the symbol. Right. So in the moment of interpretation, I'm saying I think the two things work quite well together.
Absolutely.
And you have made them work. And for that magic, I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, homie.
Please, the floor is yours.
Wait, I have a microphone.
Did you think I gave you the openings you wanted?
Anybody have a question?
About Schrodinger's cat.
We really kept on schedule here, right?
Do you want to talk about something
No,
else?
no, that's fine.
Can I just ask a question just to
course.
start, since
Start
I
things
don't
up.
see any hands up? You know, you're down at Johns Hopkins with some people who believe in forking paths, the multiverse.
Yeah.
Do you get into a lot of fights?
I wouldn't call them fights. So and Melissa's referring in particular to, you mentioned him before, my colleague Sean Carroll is a wonderful colleague to have. He's in fact part of the board that makes decisions for the Alexander Grass Humanities Institute. I wanted to have a scientist, but also a scientist with that kind of sensitivity and ability to work with philosophy. He's jointly appointed in philosophy and physics. So Sean is known as, in some ways, the most forceful proponent of the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics right now. And you can, if you're interested in this, a dialogue, an argument, if you will, between the two of us is online. He has a wonderful podcast called Mindscape, and we go at it a little bit about that. The idea here, I think, is that, look, the many worlds interpretation is an interpretation. It's mathematical, it's math that works, but it's also a philosophical interpretation of the phenomena that it attempts to explain of quantum mechanics. So this is, I would never, of course, as a non-physicist, I would never say that I'm in a place to have a debate with Sean Carroll about the math or the physics, but at the time that it rises to something like a philosophical interpretation, a conflict between two philosophical interpretations of what's actually going on there, that I think is sort of the right moment to have it. And what I'm trying to do in this book, and what becomes the basis for this kind of a disagreement, is to make the claim, and there are other, I'm not alone in this. One of the physicists, and you mentioned the relational interpretation of quantum mechanics. One of the physicists with whom I deeply agree on this issue, and whom I cite in my favor, is Carlo Rovelli. And Rovelli borrows some of his terminology to talk about instances in cosmology like the multiverse, or in the interpretation of quantum mechanics that's known as the many worlds. He refers to them as metaphysical overreach. And the idea here that I wanted to ask is, why are we tempted to make that kind of a metaphysical overreach? What is the payoff for us as physicists in saying, well, it's so important that we not accept the Heisenbergian principle in this one sentence that the particle doesn't have a path until we observe it. It's so important that the path be there that we're willing to allow a practically infinite number of universes branching off from each other at every moment of interaction. What is it about that? And I think the idea there is that we become committed unconsciously to an interpretation of what reality must be, rather than, and this was the insistence of Heisenberg all along, just try to explain the phenomena. Just try to explain the experimental results. Don't commit yourself to anything more than that, and follow them where they go. And I think that's one of the, what I call in some cases a preternatural patience on his part that didn't always serve him well, for example, in the political realm. But it did in physics, because it was that patience to just say, I'm not going to commit to something that seems so commonplace and so obvious as a particle must have a path before you observe it. His willingness to forego that is what ultimately got the physics right.
So there's a lot of physicists in the room, I can see you.
A lot of what? There are physicists in the room.
Do any physicists have a question? Or anybody? Would you like to? I'm sorry.
Thanks. I just wanted to ask on that point of metaphysical overreach that you just brought up, I'm wondering if you think that Heisenberg himself, in that statement that a particle has no path until we measure it, is also overreaching metaphysically, because the presumption of the existence of a particle as a point is embedded in that.
It is, yeah.
And in all these antinomies that you're pointing out, right, it's the overrun of the human imagination. Like when we're thinking about the question of free will and determinism, it's the imagining of this sequence of causal events, one linked to another, that we're projecting out there as we're trying to understand our immediate perceptions. And I just wanted to ask where you come down on that, whether we should be with Wittgenstein in thinking that whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. Remember that when he wrote that sentence, it was in a letter to Wolfgang Pauli. It was in reaction to what was sort of the surprise of what was arising out of his calculations and the results of the experiments. And later, when he was called into, in fact, philosophical debates there was a great neo-Kantian by the name of Grete Hermann, who came and engaged Heisenberg and his team in debates about the meaning of what he had discovered. He was, shall we say, more philosophically, he practiced more epistemic humility at that point. Because she said, don't we ultimately have to say there either is something like an atom there or not? And he said, the truth of the matter is we don't know what an atom is. Right? We have a word, and the word refers to something that's down there. But we make a mistake if we then allow that word to congeal into some kind of an image that we have. Right? He was reacting, as he said in his autobiography years later, he was reacting to his childhood chemistry classes, where he was taught kind of the structure of molecules with, as he said, kind of models that hook together, and he found these to be deeply unsatisfying. And then he would read the Timaeus by Plato and have this idea of the elements being manifestations of fundamental shapes, which he also found deeply unsatisfied. But the clash between the two made him think something along those lines. We don't actually know. And so in a very long book that he then, well, I should say he ruminated on it for many, many years, because it's called The Manuscript of 1942. It was eventually published after his death under the title that he had proposed for Reality and Its Order. He suggests that really the problem is our relationship to language and how we use language to explain the phenomena of the world. And he broke down our levels of engagement with reality linguistically into different ways of using language, from all the way the closest he could think of as an objective scientific language, which is only an ideal, we can strive for it, all the way to poetry. And he said, in a way that was deeply reminiscent of Borges, but also deeply representative of his own uncertainty principle, you need both, but they're not going to register in the same way. You need both to think. You need the accuracy of a certain more objective language, and you need the flexibility of a more poetic language. But echoing something that Pauli had said to him about the position and momentum of a particle, it's as if you can see one with one eye and one with the other, but if you try to open both eyes at the same time, everything goes into a blur, and you get a...
And that's also, in a way, the Wittgensteinian point. That's why I brought up the whole question of language, which is one area that you talk about discourses rather than, language. So I think that's extremely important, but here, when you talk about this, we don't know what the atom is, we give it. I'm reminded of the Borgesian dog.
That's exactly, as you should be, I think.
Yeah, exactly reminded of the Borgesian dog, So we give it at one time this description, another time that description, and somehow it's working through the differences between them, where the question of linguistic ambivalence and the construction of signification.
In the case of the dog, the idea is the most concrete. That's what Borges is playing around with, right? The most concrete, seemingly unquestionable word that we use in the easiest possible way. This character, who's the perfect observer, who can see everything as it appears in that purportedly as it appears, and is resistant to the generalization that would be required to scan over these moments, these different moments in space-time, is irritated that we're using such a simple word, right? But the idea being, of course, we need that word in order to put a label not to the thing itself, but to our ability to combine those things under one category. Particle, to go back to that sentence.
And also the iterative nature of it. That every mention of the dog is not the mention of a dog or simply the category, it's raining cats and dogs, immediately shifts the nature of dogginess.
Iterative is important.
Yeah, that's what
Yeah, iterative is extremely important. Heisenberg notes this himself. He credits an argument, another one on a different occasion with Einstein, with having actually prodded him to the discovery in a late night walk around Fayed Park in Copenhagen of the uncertainty principle. And what happens is that Einstein was saying, look, you have to have a coherent theory. Your theory isn't coherent. You don't actually say what's out there, but that's not doing science. And he was very frustrated. Heisenberg was frustrated by this, and he came back and he said, well, wait a minute, something he's saying is right, but at the same time it's deeply wrong. Because the problem is we always have theories, and those theories tell us what we're expecting to see. And then he gives the example of the cloud chamber. He says, what is it? I'm looking at the dots of condensation that come up in the cloud chamber, and I'm expecting there to be a line behind them. I'm connecting the dots in my mind. But each of those tiny points of condensation is so much bigger than the purported particle that must have gone through there. So then he goes and he does the calculations that then ultimately do yield the exact mathematical formulation of the uncertainty principle, based on that, on a reaction to Einstein's having provoked him with that line.
This is the challenge that this book poses to us, which is what is the unreason? What is the value of unreason that then sprouts the problems of language, the problem of freedom, the problem of agency, the problem of subjectivity, and indeed the problem of history? Yeah. I think that's, to me, a very compelling way of placing it.
And the term that you just pointed to actually comes from a line from Borges. He uses this. He calls it crevices of unreason. Right? And he says that essentially what we try to do is, he says we are dreaming the world. We're all the time dreaming the world all the time. We dream it firm. We dream it consistent over time. But our overreach, if you will, leaves in that dream crevices of unreason. And those crevices of unreason pop up all the time. And we find them, he says, in the antinomies of Kant, which is exactly what then Kant said, that antinomies, these contradictions, these seeming incompatibilities between our theories and the world, they pop up when we allow reason to overrun its boundaries, when we attempt to say the things that we should be saying just about our experience in space and time is true beyond space and time, outside of space and time, that we can characterize the absolute whole of existence.
And I think that's where the iterative nature of the unconscious stops you short and makes you then rethink which crevice is this? It's not one big crevice. There are all these little fissionary moments, and I think that's
You're trying to cover
that you're trying to cover. Exactly.
A crevice.
Hello. I wanted to start by thanking you for coming and speaking. It was very insightful.
Thank you.
But you touched on the point that the presence or the presence of an atom or the pathway of a poem, like you mentioned, only exists with its interpretation or its perception. So would you say that the pathway of an atom or an interpretation of something doesn't exist if it is not perceived or interpreted?
What I would say is that something exists, but when we do science, and here I'm just really parroting Heisenberg himself, when we do science, we need to remind ourselves that what we're studying is not nature itself. We're studying nature as it reveals itself to our instruments of knowledge, by which he also meant the very structures that we have for perceiving the world, that reveals itself as spatial, as temporal. These are not things that exist out there in the world as we perceive them to be, but rather the modes of our engagement with whatever there is out in the world. And that's okay. And this is exactly what Kant was ultimately saying about science too. You don't say goodbye to the world, right? It's not that the world itself out there doesn't exist in some kind of a radical solipsistic sense at all. No, you're accepting that when you're trying to do science, you're doing science about the world as it exists for beings like us.
Do you think representation is a good way of thinking about the level, the screen at which we work in this area, which is not to say the world does not exist, but to say, I think in a Wittgensteinian sense, that we have these indices, or we have these representations.
Or filters.
Or filters,
right,
yeah.
Ways of structuring our engagement with the sensorial.
I mean, there is this mediation, we are never, yes,
right.
there is the mediation.
And the idea, and that would be the metaphysical desire, is to get beyond mediation.
Exactly.
Arrive at the immediate, total immediate knowledge. And one after another, all of what Borges' stories do is remind us of the devastation that could be political, in pleno ucbar orbis tertius. It could be metaphysical. It could be simply the devastation of knowledge itself in various of his parables, but the devastation that occurs if you assume that you can get there, right? If you try to get the ultimate payoff of closing the gap, the difference between what it is to know the world and the world itself.
The journey is more interesting in a way than the destination.
The journey is the only thing that's possible.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Wow. I'm just thinking about where I turn the high voltage on.
Oh, there you are.
Apparently they like talking to you more than anybody else. They like listening to you two talk to each other. Did you have a question? One last question? We have only one time for one question. I seem to be wandering around. I know.
Yeah.
We got quite a lot done in a short period.
We were rigorous.
Hi. So I think this clearly it's a subjective question for each person. But so where do you draw the line between what is empirical science and in this case physics and everything that is not and beyond and not physics?
I like to use the metaphor of toolboxes. That we have different languages, different toolboxes, different ways of interacting with the world. I think these different languages or toolboxes are usually used with different ends in mind. You're asking different questions in the empirical sciences than you are when you're interpreting a poem, for example, or deciding on what to do, whether it's ethical or not. These are not reducible. I'm not trying to blur out the differences between them. But I do think at some fundamental level, there is a commonality to the fundamental problem lying underneath them, which has to do with this irreducible difference between a human being and the way that the human being comes to know the world and what he or she is trying to know.
I have to say, total fun. Did you guys have any fun? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Hannah. Thank you.
This was a great conversation. We don't usually do this. We just have like a scientist standing up and saying stuff. I love this. Thank you very much, Homie.
My pleasure.
Thank you,
very much for
Melissa.
coming, Bill.
Thank you, Claire. Thanks, everyone, for
Thank
coming.
you.